My name is Jerry Hoffman. I am a member of Nativity Lutheran Church and a participant in an effort to expose the threats posed by advocates of Christian nationalism. I'm a follower of Jesus, whose life and ministry manifested love to all people. I believe God is love. Where love is, God is. God's love is inclusive. Every person is to be treated with respect. Absence of love is manifest in every effort to exclude others from full participation in the governments of our country, whether by race, nationality, religion, political party, economic status, age, and sexual orientation. It's my privilege today to introduce the Minnesota State Senator John Marty to inform, enlighten, give perspective, awaken us to the threats posed by Christian nationalism, and to prescribe what positive steps need to be taken to dismantle its influence. John is a lifelong Lutheran, graduate of St. Olaf College. He and his remarkable wife, Connie, have 2 adult children. I know John is a person who has deeply rooted Christian values, which respects the dignity of every human being. He continues to have an effective career as a Minnesota State Senator for 37 years. Wow. You're young when you became Senator, John. He will make a presentation, and then we'll welcome questions and things. This will be the roving mic. So if you want to raise a question or make a statement, raise your hand, and I will come to you. Okay? John.
Thank you. Really pleased to be back here. Jerry Hoffman didn't mention that, as many of you know, Connie and I were members here with our kids for many years. We're now a church in South Minneapolis where we were married. But it's really good to be back here and see so many people and meet so many new people as well. I'm really glad that Nativity is taking a focus on threats of Christian nationalism. When I see some of the parallels from the 1930s and how very strong movements, this is our identity, we are, whatever, the German church in Nazi Germany, half of the church just kind of, oh, well, if this is what it is, well, it's promoting our religion in some way or another. But it's become very, very much, this is what you believe and you believe, we all believe it, and you don't believe it, well, you better start believing it. And the hatred and division, I always think of what Christian nationalists are calling for is about to, what I see Christianity as, is about what the Pharisees were to Christ's teaching. They were, oh, yeah, we're really steeped in the church is what matters, but their gospel quickly goes away from the gospel and into a very narrow political agenda. And during my years in the legislature, I grew up, my dad marched at Selma in 1965, civil rights movement. We were active, and if you looked at the pictures back then, all the white people in the pictures were all religious folk. They were rabbis, priests, nuns, ministers, and that's because the church was seen as we're supposed to break down barriers, we're supposed to get people to live together. And that's what I've always seen the gospel as, but that was the most active, politically active, quote, part of the church. In the 1970s and 80s, some folks who I don't think were focused on the religion, but focused on the agenda that they wanted to pass, formed a group called the Moral Majority and other things like that. So all my years in office, since I started in 1986, all my years in office, when the news media talked about on an issue, oh, this is a religious issue. Abortion, gay marriage, things like that were all religious issues, and the Christian position was what the Moral Majority had. Now the media has kind of gotten the sense that, you know, it's anytime you put people, oh, those people believe this, you're really discounting all the members of the group because not everybody believes this because they happen to be Lutheran, because they happen to be white, because they happen to be gay because they happen to be whatever. We're not all the same, and when we treat others as the other, that's what one of the fears of the Christian nationalism. But what scares me about it now is since the 1970s, 80s, there's been this move of a very strong theocratic pushing people. This is what we believe, and you have to live your lives by our beliefs, which is fundamentally different than what I think our nation was founded by. But at that time, it was kind of a small number of people who thought we should have a theocracy and we should have to do all the things our Constitution prohibits, like a religious test for holding office and so on. But we've gotten more and more people more vocally saying it. In the past, it was kind of seen as more fringe to say, oh, we think we should have a theocracy. Some of the people who would push for that may have been the ones who 10 years ago were concerned, oh, we're going to have Sharia law, and if you're Muslim, you believe in Sharia law, and what Sharia law, what we tell you it is, and it's all this hateful stuff. But it was a government, it's part of how somebody sees government, and that's not our constitutional way of doing it. We recognize we have so many diversities in our country, and we all get along if we treat each other as human beings, which is what our faith tells us to do. But it's taken nasty tone in the last 5, 6 years. I've seen more and more elected members of Congress and so on say this should be a theocracy, it was intended by one, and so on. And the thing that makes it most scary to me is there was a poll out last summer, and it said that it was 2021 poll, American Enterprise Institute, which does polling. It's a more conservative policy issue group, but they do polling. And they did a poll on how many, if you think politicians won't take care of protecting our values, is it appropriate, might it ever be appropriate for people to take up violent action, for citizens to take up violent action against their government because the government is not doing the right thing? And 39%, the headline on National Public Radio was, quote, scary finding. 4 in 10 Republicans say political violence may be necessary. And that's what scares me when you have a significant portion of the public saying political violence is okay. It's not just one group. I mean, there are all kinds of groups. If they see violence is acceptable, they take it on as themselves. And that, to me, is a very scary one when we have people who see themselves as building a Christian nation, and as part of that, we can enforce our provisions. And just to see how, this is a guy who, you may have read Gary North stuff, but a Christian nationalist in 1982 made a well-publicized statement talking about religious liberty and how it's going to help crush religious liberty. He said, quote, we must use the doctrine of religious liberty to gain independence for Christian schools until we train up a generation of people who know there is no religious neutrality, no neutral law, no neutral education, and no neutral civil government. Then they will get busy in constructing a Bible-based social, political, religious order which finally, and this is the kicker sentence, which finally denies the religious liberty of the enemies of God. So he's in effect saying we're going to use religious liberty, which I think we all agree is constitutionally guaranteed us. And they're going to use the guise of religious liberty to push policies that they think will help them take over, and then they can deny religious liberty to those other people who don't believe what we believe. And the whole concept of theocracy is scary, and it's become, in our country and I think in several other countries, it's become a very far right-wing thing where they worship guns, they worship, I think literally worship guns. And there was a New Yorker cartoon of a guy at the pearly gates, and he's packing a handgun, and St. Peter says, trust me, it is not a God-given right. And the point is, how do we regulate our society? How do we deal with every political issue? Well, we, in a democracy, want to have all points of view heard. If somebody thinks that there should be no constitutional restrictions on guns, they should speak out. They should have a voice at the table, but so should people who disagree with them. And as we see in the Mideast right now, how important it is to break things down. But I want to spend a few minutes talking about some of the experience I've seen in Christian nationalism at our state capitol here. About 20 years ago, Michelle Bachmann was elected as one of my colleagues, and she was one who I would say was one of the few back then who would talk about we're a Christian nation and we should be this. Her biggest issue was the constitutional amendment to prohibit same-sex marriage from happening. And I remember she and her team of her prayer team would come around to all of the Senate desks when we weren't in there and pray over our desks, praying for us. I think they were praying for us to take their position on the issue they were there for. But that was one of the first experiences where I had, because I've worked with people of both parties for years and so on, and people with very strong religious beliefs, very strong differences, but who could respect each other and respect those who disagree. And so I had that happening. And then the last few years it sped up. In 2018, there was a Senate colleague of mine, a chaplain, who introduced a bill that would require schools to take, if somebody provides them with a plaque or something, plaques or signs that say, "In God we trust." And he said this would unite us. Why did we need this? It would bring respect. School teachers don't have respect. We need respect in the schools. We need respect for people. We need to trust each other and so on. And that's what putting "In God we trust" posters in the schools will do. And he said 79% of people in America believe in God. Again, that's probably a fairly accurate poll for 8, 9 years ago in terms of what percent believe in some supreme being. And so he was saying, we got to do this for their sake, and it'll bring us all together. And I'm telling him, you know, when we have a vote where it's very sharply divided and strong arguments, it may not necessarily be bringing people together. But I talked about how, as a Christian and having grown up strong household of faith and everything else, when I read the gospel and how Jesus overturns the money changers in the temple and he doesn't accept the way things are, I said, I find it kind of offensive that my money says "In God we trust" on it. Because he's saying this is the national motto. And it's not been the national motto for 200 some years. It was in the 1950s that it came into being. And I said, you know, I have strong religious beliefs, but I don't want anybody else's, I don't want government pushing my religious beliefs on somebody else's or somebody else's on me. I think that's the whole concept of it. And so I said, you know, this is offensive. I said, on behalf of the 21% of the people that my colleague thought didn't believe in a supreme being, it's not welcoming to those school kids. For many of the 79%, they're people of other faiths who may not see that as a welcoming sign. One of my colleagues tried to say, well, you want us to post "In Allah we trust" in the school? Oh, no, that's different. That's specific God. When we talk about God, we mean our God, but you all should mean the same thing. And so the bill went out there, and I was speaking on behalf of that 21% and the other 79% of different religions, and a good chunk of the people who might have what they would call the Christian religion, who find it offensive that somebody else is trying to promote their religion onto others. And it's vague generalities. As soon as you get into specifics, people find it more questionable. But when they're pushing for a Christian nationalism, I think they're saying, we're going to do it this way, and you'll be fine with it. Just trust us. And I have a problem with that. In this case, that "In God We Trust" bill passed the House and the Senate. The governor vetoed it, so it did not take effect. But that was only the first of several things that came up fairly quickly. The Historical Society, about 2019, the majority in the Senate was coming in with budget cuts for things, small budget cuts, because you know times are tough, we should cut the budgets. And Historical Society was just being slashed, I mean, like cut by 2/3 or so. And they run all our state historical things, and it's not a state agency, but it's operating a lot of contracts with the state, and we provide a big chunk of their funding. And the budget cut for it was very severe. I was on the finance committee, and one of my colleagues said, why are you cutting the Historical Society 10 times as deep as anything else? What's there? And the author of the bill said, well, we need to cut the money. Well, you wouldn't do it just that, but she said, well, it's because of the controversy. And I jumped at, what controversy? And it's a secret controversy. This is in a Senate hearing. In a Senate hearing, one of my colleagues, it's a secret controversy. And so several others and I were kind of, what do you mean a secret controversy? You're telling us we can't provide funding to the Historical Society because of a secret controversy. Then another one of my colleagues, well, you know, it's actually because Fort Snelling wanted to change the signs, just say Fort Snelling at Bedote, which is the crossing of water, which is the native name for the place. They wanted to do that, and some of us found that controversial. I'm thinking that's what they're going to cut their budget and blow up the Historical Society for. That's all I heard about that, and their budget did not get cut in the end. The governor said he wouldn't accept that, and they changed. But about a year later, I had gotten involved because when we had the In God We Trust fight, it kind of blew up. Apparently my colleague went to Fox News and did an interview with them, must have said some pretty rough things about me. I was at church that morning. It was a Sunday morning, and I came home and had the most vile, obscene phone message on our answering machine about how I hate God and how I hate America and I hate everything else and I hate this. And I figured something went out about this. I was thinking it must have been because of the debate a few days ago. And sure enough, we started getting more phone calls and home phone and everything else. And I figured out, yes, it was a TV broadcast on this. Fox and Friends had it on Sunday morning. Then they called and asked if I wanted to debate it the next day. So I figured, well, might as well. They're going to say what they're going to say anyway. I'd like to have a chance to do so. So I got invited to debate the next day. And it was interesting setup. I was at not the local Fox affiliate, which doesn't provide, but in a little box studio in the WCCO building with a little camera on the wall. That's all I could see. No monitor for me to see who I'm talking to. And afterwards, when I saw what they aired, there are three of them sitting in their Washington newsroom, and one of whom is the debater who's debating against me. And she's reading from the teleprompter. You can see her eyes going back and forth. And I'm seeing none of this, just hearing a headpiece to do it. And what I said was basically, I'm somebody who takes my faith very seriously, and this is true. I'm a great-grandson, the grandson, the son, the brother, and now father of Lutheran ministers. So we take our faith pretty seriously. And how I don't want my religion being pushed on others or anyone else's pushed on me. And the other woman debating said, well, Democrats hate God. And okay, and she said, ever since the such and such national convention when they booed God, they've hated God. And so that was her spiel and a bunch of things and so on. So I went and said, you know, I think you're mischaracterizing some of what some of us feel, and that I came home from church to a vile call about how I hate God. And she gave her rebuttal, which was basically the same speech again. And I see it's all set up there, joking with each other, and here's a voice with a box from a studio, and talking about it. And the good news was I did get one phone call the next day, somebody from Maryland or West Virginia or something. Back then it was easier to find phone numbers. It still is not that hard. But I got one phone call, and it was a guy who said he appreciated my comments. He said he heard on Sunday morning what I said, and he was so mad at me that somebody could be so hateful of Christianity and so hateful of God. And then he heard me on Monday on the debate, and he said, I agreed with everything you said. In other words, he doesn't want people to be attacking Christianity. He doesn't want people to be doing all these other things, but, oh, yeah, we shouldn't be imposing our beliefs on others. And I thought that's the whole point. Because the In God We Trust fight came out of what I found out later was a Project Blitz, which was the playbook of the group that started with the Congressional Prayer Caucus and Legislative Prayer Caucuses. It started with all of them and brought them all together. And they are pushing this agenda. And their Project Blitz was a blueprint. A religious writer and scholar who contacted me after the debate told me about the group and showed me their web pages. And it's very clear. They used to post them publicly. They're not public anymore, but we have the old ones. And we do the simple things first, requiring posting of the 10 Commandments on the courthouse steps, in God we trust things on license plates, because hardly anybody objects to that. Then we'll go to tougher stuff. Then we'll go to the issues we care most about, which tend to be anti-LGBTQ things and so on. But we'll go there and we will build this up and we'll get this stuff written into law and then we can move forward. And I'm scared that that's what they are continuing to do. I know they will continue to do it. And the In God We Trust was one of the easy steps. Fighting things like overturning marriage equality are the second or third tier. But they have a strategy, and it's been in place, a national strategy. You'll see very similar bills introduced in multiple states. So I dropped in a bill a couple of years ago, a resolution. It's meaningless, but it would be meaningless in the sense it doesn't change the law. But it would declare January 16th is Religious Liberty Day. Because January 16th, and the federal government does so too. It's not a holiday, but it's a declared day. That's the day that Thomas Jefferson's Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom was implemented 250 some years ago. And that was the foundation of the First Amendment. I think it was very clear that that's where they pulled when drafting the First Amendment on religious liberty. So I put in a resolution saying that we should all reflect on the wonders of our religious liberty and our freedom of conscience, that we can believe what we believe in this country and so on. And I dropped in this resolution. It quotes Thomas Jefferson saying, because lots of the folks on the Christian right say Thomas Jefferson and all the nation's founders were Christian. And Jefferson says, you know, we need to guarantee the religious liberty of the people of every sect, probably every denomination. And he said, of the Hindu, which was spelled archaically Hindoo, the Hindu, the Mohammedan, all people, whether they're believers in any religion or not. We want to protect their rights. And so this resolution shouldn't be controversial. It hasn't gotten a hearing, but I think it will be, because the author of the In God We Trust bill came up to me after he saw the bill introduced. He said, John, well, I like that. I saw you got a religious liberty thing. I said, I certainly hope so. But the trouble is, his view of religious liberty is the one that Gary North said 20 or 40 years ago, namely that first we use the system to take over, so we have the power. We got to claim religious liberty for us to do what we want. Then when we take over, then we deny religious liberty to others. And that resolution, I told him I hope he'd support it. I don't think he would have. He's been defeated from the legislature. But these issues don't go away. The latest one is one where we have had a system where we fund public education in the state. People can do what they want with private education, but we fund public education. And one of the wonderful programs, I think our kids and a lot of folks in this congregation know people who did the post-secondary enrollment options, where you can get education credit in higher education while you're at school and the school district pays the cost. And one of my colleagues pointed out that there are some colleges in the state that, lots of the colleges have Christian affiliations in most cases, but 2 or 3 of them says if you want to attend the school, you have to sign a pledge saying you believe this, and very specific things. And our post-secondary enrollment options is like our public schools for everyone. And so if you are a junior in high school and want to start getting college credit, you can do it and your school district pays for it. Well, one of the schools fairly near here had required people to sign certain pledges about what they will do and won't do and what they believe and don't believe. And my colleagues were saying, wait, the only students who can qualify for this state funding then are those who will take that pledge. And the schools fought against it. The provision passed, but they've challenged it in court, and I think I'm confident the law will survive. But basically, I said, we're not, because the schools were saying, we're taking our religious liberty away. And we said, no, you can believe whatever you want. But if you want this public money for these students, then you have to allow any student who doesn't believe it to have that same access to that. They said it was discriminating against them. I keep thinking our community has plenty of people of other faiths than Christianity or non-faiths, and having them have to sign something if they want to go to that conveniently located local college. And so I'm convinced that that was one that the courts will be fine on, because I think it's very clearly saying we want people to promote their own religion any way they want, but we don't think government dollars should be going for that. And if you're going to, I mean, all the other colleges that had the post-secondary students, those that were, quote, Christian affiliated, real or just historically affiliated with them, they were allowed to continue their practice. They could keep taking the post-secondary students because they take people of every religion and every faith, and they accept people who are not of their exact religion. But in the next, I want to stop here now and open it up for discussion, but in the past couple years, when you see the polls where 4 in 10 Republicans say that they think it's justified in this country for people to take up arms against the government because they think something is unfair, to preserve the democracy or whatever. And when you have that kind of, that strong of feelings that we will actually take violent action against somebody to get what we want, is scary when you see so many people saying, yes, this is a theocracy. And I just remember, I forgot one, and I apologize, I forgot one thing in the story about the Historical Society funding. The reason that I found out a year later was that the Historical Society, which is a government-related but nonprofit, they have a membership group and they have an annual banquet, and they had invited a speaker, Stephen Green from out in Oregon, to come in and talk because he had written a book about how the nation's founding wasn't Christian. It was not intended as a Christian nation. And he was invited there, and the Historical Society got a letter from the Legislative Prayer Caucus saying, we hear you're inviting this guy there. His book is full of lies and everything else, and we ask that you cancel his thing. Then they send a second one and say, well, if you won't cancel it, let's debate him. And the head of the Historical Society said he'll get back to them. And then they had a letter from their chaplain writing to the Historical Society CEO saying, we want to know what you're going to do about this because budget negotiations at the Capitol are happening soon, and basically threatening we'll cut your funding for this. So we found out the real reason in the end was that they were being threatened, and the Historical Society did not back down. This guy came and spoke. It was interesting that one of their letters to him when they were mad at the Historical Society for not doing it, they said, this guy his book is full of errors and so on. And then they said, we haven't read the book yet, but we just got a copy. And so it's a very weird thing, but the Historical Society invited him and they tried to cut the funding, and they weren't even willing to tell us that that was the issue, that it was their religious differences with the Historical Society. So with that, I'd love to open it up for discussion. And
please raise hello, hello. Please raise your hand, and I'll come to you, and you can ask your question.
While you're doing it, I'll tell you about, go ahead, ask questions, but we had we formed last year a secular government caucus. And some of the members of the caucus are people who are agnostic or atheists or other beliefs and so on. Some of us are people of faith. I helped found the caucus because the whole point of it, and I think the name is apt. We can all be people of faith or non-faith, whatever our conscience brings us to, but politically, government should not be making decisions based on that. And so I think it's important for us as Christians, for me to be there saying, hey, I don't want this stuff to happen either. And I think that's why I appreciate what you're doing here with this issue.
Hi, Senator Marty. Thank you for being here. My name is Laura Oxnevad, and I'm actually a school board member for the local school district. I'm curious if you have any opinions on school vouchers and how that relates to this topic.
Sure. And I've not been a big fan of school vouchers, but I think the reason it became an issue and became a partisan issue is because a growing number of students are either being homeschooled or there are a lot of Christian homeschools and other things where they want to send people there. And the vouchers basically saying we're going to provide funding for people to do their own school thing. I oppose the vouchers because for education policy, but it is very clearly tied to this because the push for vouchers came from people, we want to have the Christian schools so we can educate the Christian generation who can take over everything. So I used to represent the St. Anthony School District, and I'm sorry I don't get to anymore.
Hi, my name is Eva Grooms. I just have a question. So what do we do now? What can we do as normal, just citizens?
The first thing I think we have to do is speak out. How people speak out used to be, oh, write a letter to the editor. Well, people still write letters to the editor, but it's one of 1,000 ways people communicate with each other. But being not afraid to talk about these issues. At the Capitol, I've been there longer than anyone right now, and I very seldom say, as a Christian, I don't know if I've ever said that, except in one type of setting, because I don't think it's my job to, I see my faith as something that shaped who I am and what I believe and everything else. And you're not supposed to go to church on Sunday and drop it all at the door and so on, but it shapes who you are. It's not supposed to do some of the other things, like impose my beliefs on others.
I've been wondering some time about inclusion and exclusion and thinking about how this country actually got settled. It was settled by the Puritans initially. They felt excluded in England by King Charles. But one of the first things they did when they got here, and not long after, they excluded Anne Hutchinson. So I've been wondering about the cyclical nature of what happens here. And have you had that kind of experience? Because it seems to me, historically in this country, we've had a rise of this idea that, you know, we're this kind of Christianity and we exclude others, and then there's times when it quells.
Yeah, I think that part of that is, well, first of all, with new technologies, everybody getting able to share their message with people who agree with them and so on, you have a lot more of that kind of division spreading. And I think that's one of the toxic things in society politics. It's so anti-Christian about promoting division and exclusion, which is all it was. And yeah, the Puritans, yeah, they were exclusively for what they believe. They were truly fleeing from another one, which is why the mastery of our country being founded then, and it wasn't perfect, and it still isn't, but at that time, with the First Amendment saying that we're going to not favor one over another. And they kind of recognized people came here because they were being oppressed by somebody else, and then they would, as you point out in many cases, exclude others as well. But as one who always sees our job as a society is to care for everyone, no exclusions, period. I mean, that's the way I think we have to be treating public policy more. We want everybody to thrive, not, well, if you can qualify for this, if not, you can do this. But a society where everybody's done that way, and you're right, it's cyclical. In the 1950s with the McCarthy era, there was a whole lot. That's when In God We Trust was put on, on money and everything else. It's been a kind of thing that it goes up and down, but the last few years with the way people get their news, we all listen to the same echo chamber, and we're told that if you care about God, you care about Christian nationalism, you care about this, you care about this. So I think it's at a high point now and a dangerous point. If you look back at the 1930s in Germany, there are a lot of horror things happening. People saying, if we do this, we're going to exclude, we're going to punish, we're going to build walls, not other things. That creates a fear, and that doesn't bring us together. And so I think you're right, the Anne Hutchinson example is good.
I'm Elaine Cole, and I want to ride on what Eva asked about what can we do. And, you know, there's the local angle on what we can do, but I'm also really frightened by the election of Mike Johnson as the Speaker of the House. And, you know, and I see things happening in Texas, and I think, well, I have no influence over these national things. And I think the people who represent me that we're aligned in how we think about stuff. So what can I do on both a local and a national level?
Well, first of all, speaking out, again, I think when somebody who is an atheist or somebody else signs a thing saying they oppose Christian nationalism, the media kind of thinks, oh, that's to be expected. But the whole concept of the Christians against Christian nationalism is a very helpful one, because there is, your simple answer to the question is there's no simple way you can do it. We're one of 330 million people in the country, and each of us can try our little effort. Certainly speaking out to neighbors, doing other things like that, but also whenever there's a way of doing it into the national attention ways, paying attention to any way you can get the word out is the bottom line, and there's no simple way to do that that guarantees it. So I think joining groups, signing petitions are all helpful. Do they make the difference? No, it's everything together makes a difference.
Steve Anderson, I have are you familiar with Hillsdale College and conservative Christian and affiliated with Trump? And I've heard that they're trying to export their curriculum to charter academies around the country, 20 some, and one of them just opened in Fargo. I don't know, is that concerning?
Yes,
is there anything happening in Minnesota?
That's exactly what is happening around here. I mean, our son teaches biology in Guadalajara, and he has this fascination for all these people who are trying to say, he's trying to explain that dinosaurs and humans may not have lived together 6,000 years ago. He's trying to explain this sort of history, and I'm sorry, I'm struggling right today, so I feel I'm embarrassed that I'm not being as coherent as I wanted to be. But I'm very worried that curriculum, my son sees the curriculums that people send out to these schools, and they send it out free because it's all subsidized by Hillsdale folks and so on. They can send it out free to people, and they spread this everywhere. And if you take polls of how many people nowadays believe the Earth is 4,000, 6,000 years old instead of 4 billion years, if you want to believe in evolution being wrong, all that sort of stuff, there's amazing number of students. That's all they've been educated in. And so I'm very concerned it is part of the same movement.
Hi, I'm Jeannie Voigt, and it seems like on the conservative side, they're so organized. So what is the problem with the rest of us? It seems like we're not very organized, and what can be done to change that so we have a way to combat the organization from the religious right?
Yes. If everybody believes the exact same thing, and you have to because this is, you're told, you're ordered to believe this, and you believe this, then you don't fight as much with each other, and you've got a very narrow agenda you can speak to. There's no simple answer to it other than trying to recognize we work together and try and, I mean, you look at any group that's trying to change society, group Sierra Club working for addressing climate change and other things, or Legal Women Voters for Democracy. How do they get people active? How do they get people involved? Because all those groups, they have sometimes declining numbers over the years, and young people are more, we're used to everybody. How do I get involved? I'll tweet, I'll put a like on somebody's post on something I like. We are not very well organized in terms of joining groups. People, well, I don't need to join this group, be a member of it, but I think we have to work together, and the Christian nationalism is sort of a encompassing right-wing thing. I mean, what some of these issues have to do with their religion, but it's very heavily anti-tax, and we can fight that politically, and that's what we're doing, but I think we have to recognize that I used to see it as we had in Minnesota 2 political parties, and nowadays I see one that's a disorganized something political party, and the other one that's becoming a fascist movement. It's kind of, we want to win elections, and we'll have elections, yes, but if we don't win them, we find ways to overturn them or whatever. And that's scary to everybody here. But how do we organize? Because that's only one of many issues we have to be involved in. I mean, people are busy and the world is complicated and there are a lot of issues. So all I can say is join groups that you agree with, work with neighbors. I think in the last several years, groups like Indivisible and others getting people active in the community makes a real difference.
John McLeod here. How much do you personally get lobbied on these topics? Not only yourself, but the legislature generally.
It's not like, hey, be pro-Christian nationalist, pass this. It's the agenda of that. Yeah, there's a lot of people. I tend not to get a lot of lobbying from that because they tell people who they think are most persuadable on things and so on. But there is a decent amount of it. It's become very partisan. There used to be a legislative prayer caucus. I was never a member of it and never felt that was something I wanted to be part of. But it used to be something that I think there were bipartisan members on. Now it's all one party. And, you know, so they're out there. They have plenty of people who are writing and calling on every issue or anything related to it. But because very few of them, this year they haven't tried any In God We Trust postings or things like that. But they continue to push I think their deeper, longer-term agenda on LGBTQ issues and so on. I think they continue to push that, and they'll introduce bills on that. But it's become more visible, and we formed the Secular Government Caucus now because we wanted to have some people realize you don't have to be, we need to speak out against the Christian nationalism and that agenda. But it's not, they've got these 3 bills this year in Minnesota. They're not going to try anything big this year.
Well, it's Karen, and I have a touchy subject to bring up, but we know that there are churches where they preach Christian nationalism. And, you know, so does that nonprofit, maybe it's more of a federal because it's tax code, but could you just kind of speak on that? And is there any movement in Minnesota about that? I mean, we're supposed to have a separation.
Right.
And yet we know that there are churches that preach that.
Sure. And the federal government, the Supreme Court rulings from 60 years ago and so on, had sort of protected, had worked out a good enough resolution to it, I think. We've allowed that to happen, but then like in St. Paul, where very little commercial industrial property relative to the population means their tax base is lower, and they have huge amounts of nonprofit land. All the church lands, all the private higher education lands, everything else is tax exempt. And that is a real subsidy. It is. When we tell tax code, if you don't think something's a subsidy, thank you very much. If I cut something from, if I cut some tax rate for your neighbor, or if you're in a business, thank you very much. If you're paying property taxes on your sales or sales taxes on your sales and your neighboring business doesn't, you're going to see how that's a big subsidy to them because you don't get it. And so churches, that's one of the questions. They had talked in St. Paul, should we take away this? They can't do that under Minnesota law, so what they could do would be to have street fees, every street footage for street maintenance and everything else, and St. Paul have done that. But that does beg the question, should we be talking about tax exemption for various groups? And I think it's been understood that the faith community since the 50s and 60s in the court rulings is the faith community, hey, we don't preach vote for so-and-so from the pulpit, we don't do that. Hey, you can, if a church is very strongly anti-LGBTQ and they believe that they're allowed to preach that and they can do that, but telling people, oh, vote for these guys or vote for this or oppose this, that's where they've crossed the line. So in the past, it didn't happen. Now they just flagrantly do it and figure the courts will say it's okay. But it is a subsidy, and I think it will be talked about more in the next decades. It's changing. Times are changing. I spoke to the Minnesota Atheist Group about 25 years ago, and they asked if they could publicize it. I said, well, why not? And, well, because a lot of politicians didn't want to be seen talking to atheists. And atheists at the time were a very small percentage of the population. And politicians always want to prove their strong religious beliefs because it was a plus for them. And so the growth in number of people now, politicians who will say they are atheist or agnostic, I'm guessing it's not where the public at large is, but it's getting closer to that. And I think that the change nowadays are more openness to talking about fair tax policy. And you have to recognize churches and any nonprofit are doing things for the community. They're helping out, which was the advantage reason for the tax code. But nowadays, I mean, hospitals, the same thing. Nonprofit hospitals, are they really serving the public interest because they become so corporatized and so on? It's the same issue, but yes, I think it's going to be discussed.
Jan Fredrickson here. One of the things that impacted me the most is that the understanding that they start at the very local level and that they start small and then they infiltrate the school boards, county commissioners, your city council and so on. So I've felt strongly of checking out to see, I live in Egan, Dakota County, and we had at school board, the last time was like only 4 people running. This year there was like 12 people running. And I think in Minnesota, it's, for me as a more liberal, we feel comfortable because we don't see that infiltration so blatantly. But I felt it's my responsibility that at this time and place, I tell others and that we pay attention to the very, very local. And you can find, like for my school board, I would go to the teachers union and see who they were endorsing because I felt as a former teacher that they would know who were supporting public schools. So you can find places that help you choose who the candidates are. And
in like in the Mounds View School District, which I now represent, the biggest part of it, I guess, my district went from Roseville down to St. Paul the last 10 years. Now it goes from central Roseville up to Blaine. So it's totally different. But the Mounds View School District is huge there, and the Roseville School District is huge. And both of them had races where there was a, I don't know the name of the group, a family group it was called, but it was a conservative Christian group, and they ran 3 candidates in Roseville for 3 seats, and they ran 4 in Moundsville where there were 4 seats open. And I talked with somebody, if all 4 of them won, they'd control the school board. And these are the ones you can't talk anything about race, you can't talk anything else. It was the right-wing agenda for this. And those 4 candidates, there were about 6 candidates who were either incumbents or whatever running, and then you split the vote. And one person said, if all 4 of them ran, they'd control the school board. I thought the trouble is if one of them gets on the school board, you change the dynamics of all the meetings. And school boards, for those who serve on school boards and have served on them, it's always been a relatively thankless job. And fortunately, most of the people who want to be on it are people who care very deeply about kids and know something about finances and can help run schools. But these folks are, most of them don't have their kids in public schools, and they came through, and I said, if one of them would win, you're going to have the dynamics changed. And maybe you recall a national news about 3-4 years ago where a woman was yelling at a school board somewhere in Arizona. It made national news. She said, I have a constitutional right to be as mean to you people as I want to be. And I thought school board meetings used to be boring and important, but boring. And now everywhere, yes, because in Moundsview and in Roseville not only had those 3 candidates, but they also had an anti-Semitic guy who was going out. He went out Rosh Hashanah and delivered anti-Semitic stuff, put it around in the synagogue, and just hate speech stuff. And people like that tend never to get very much traction, but when they clothe themselves in the parents' rights Christians, they have been able to win a number of school board seats.
Just a quick follow-up on that. I followed the results of those races in Moundsview and Roseville and looked at those specific candidates, and I thought it was really interesting that the vote totals, let's say the 3, those 3 had identical vote totals. So there was a block of people who have been reached out to by these organizations, and they numbered in that race between 4,000 and 5,000 people in that community. So I found that gave me something to think about, not just the result, not just whether or not they got on the school board, but that in that community there's a block of that many people interacting about the Christian nationalist ideas. So.
And you're right, they're very well organized, and they're told that, I remember living in northwestern Roseville, going to our polling place a few years ago, and some of the students at the local college who were bussed over there were, who are we supposed to vote for this one? Because somebody didn't have their list. And I thought, I'm really troubled when college students or anyone are being told, these are the candidates you have to vote for. But that's how they do it. And then in a school board race like that, I mean, this year in Minnesota, it came through pretty clearly where those weren't. But there's school board races that might have been $1,000 were $15,000 races now. And I worry about it when the country is so divided on something like that, where people are, I mean, most of the candidates in Mounds View, I think at least, I don't know if any of them had kids in the schools. One of them didn't have any kids, and that's fine. They have a right to be heard too, but it's all because even though we don't have any kids, we are in favor of parents' rights, and the parents should be deciding this. And that and book bans and everything else like that, it's a very scary thing that school boards deal with.
I had one thing to say about Mounds View, too. This is Elaine Cole. There was one of those 4 candidates did have children in the Mounds View schools. And they came around and were talking to me at my house. And these people were very smooth. And I really did not feel well equipped to, you know, how do I ask questions that they're not going to be able to weasel out of? You know, what are the magic words? Because they certainly had their slate of magic words and were pushing their agenda in a very smooth way. So it's getting really dangerous out there because they're not all wingnuts who are handing out anti-Semitic things at temples on Rosh Hashanah.
Yeah, it's right. It's the smoothness of the candidate. They don't identify. They have been saying vote for me and these other candidates on the team and so on, but which is okay behavior to do, but they don't say anything other than we want parents' rights and more quality education and so on. But I think the agenda, when you go back to school vouchers and everything like that, you're going to have a huge change in policy if some of them are on the boards, and I'm not sure they're looking out for the interests of public education.
We have one final question.
Well, I'm just wondering if you could comment about the Supreme Court as well, because some of these court cases that have been brought to the Supreme Court actually had people who didn't actually have a problem, but they were manufactured problems.
That's a really good one. The Supreme Court has been, it's the most radical Supreme Court in terms of throwing out any precedent they want on any issue, and their logic or what their theory is seems to be, we'll apply that because that might help us in this case, even if they're kind of junk theories. But Supreme Court has been willing to do this. In the case you named, the woman in Colorado, I believe it was, who was, I don't know if she had a wedding planning business or not, but she said, if I had a wedding planning business and some gay couple came to me and asked me to do it, like the Colorado Baker case, if they asked me to do it, I believe because I have strong religious beliefs, should be allowed to deny that. And yeah, the Supreme Court has been scary in terms of saying this stuff is okay. And I remember, well, probably 10 years ago when the constitutional amendment on allowing same-sex marriage was voted on, the year after when we allowed same-sex marriage, one of my colleagues who was a very, very sincere conservative Christian, he said, John, the trouble I have now, I understand why people want to get married, but the trouble is if I'm a business and I'm a landlord and I don't want to rent to a same-sex couple. He said, what do I do? And I said, well, just look back 60 years, the U.S. Supreme Court ruling on Virginia versus Loving, you could not ban interracial couples from marrying. I said, they ruled that out. And even though there were Christians saying, oh, that's separation of the sex because the the Christian opposition to that at the time was that the Bible opposes race mixing. And so he said, but John, that's different. That's racism. And I said, but this is the same thing. They are allowed to not like interracial marriages, but they have to rent to them. You are allowed to not like same-sex couples, but if you're doing business, you have to do business with them. And he couldn't understand why. I thought, one, because he said, this is a moral issue. That one's just racism. And it's just beyond him. So the Supreme Court has a huge say in this, and unfortunately, I don't trust that we're going to get a lot of help on that. But I think the best way to fight it is the awareness, which is what you're trying to do. And I want to apologize again now at the end for, I should have, when the pain didn't stop going away, I should have canceled this and rescheduled. But I appreciate your work as a congregation and your work and interest in this issue, because our democracy relies on us winning this issue.
Appreciate your reflection, your intelligence, information that you shared about what's happening, and thank you very, very much.